Louisiana is covered in monuments most people never see. More than 800 ancient mound sites sit across the state. Some are older than the pyramids in Egypt, and most sit in plain sight, in fields, in suburbs, under churches, on a college campus, while people drive past without knowing what they're looking at. These were not built by a lost civilization. They were built by Native American peoples whose descendants still live in Louisiana. What no one can fully explain is why and how. You'll see a 5,000-year-old monument used to dump yard waste, a giant earthen tower a town carted away for a bridge ramp. Two Mound scientists are still openly fighting about, and at number 1, people with no wheels who moved earth by hand, basket by basket, to build a giant bird out of soil. Stick with us to the end, because that one is number 1. This channel digs into the history buried under ordinary American ground. Subscribe now, because we go down a rabbit hole like this every week. Today we are counting down 12 ancient structures in Louisiana that no one can fully explain. Number 12. Frenchman's Bend. The Mounds hiding in a golf subdivision. Outside Monroe in Ouachita Parish, there is a quiet residential development. Mowed lawns, trimmed trees, a golf course, a sprinkler running somewhere, an errant ball rolling into the rough. And scattered among the houses are at least 5 earthen mounds that are more than 5,000 years old. They were built sometime between 3,700 and 3000 BCE by hunter-gatherers, not farmers, people who moved with the seasons and still organized to raise monuments beside a natural ridge near Bayou Desiard. That places them among the oldest human-made structures anywhere in North America, grouped with Watson Brake and Caney as the early benchmarks. These mounds are only still standing because of one decision. When archaeologist Joe Saunders first studied the site, the bulldozers were already there, clearing the land for the houses and the fairways. The landowner, Bishop Johnston, was sympathetic to preservation, and he reworked his plans to build around them. So today they remain on private land between cul-de-sacs. In the detail that lingers, when researchers visited, they found one 5,000-year-old mound being used to dump old potting soil and another piled with yard brush. Some of the oldest monuments on the continent quietly turned into garden corners by people who never knew. Number 11. Insley Mounds. 3 mounds on a forgotten bayou. Drive south out of Delhi, about 7 miles, down a 2-lane road through cotton and soybean country, and you'll pass a low bluff over Bayou Macon. On it stand 3 earthen mounds. There's a roadside marker. There is almost nothing else. Insley is a stop on Louisiana's Ancient Mounds Trail, a self-guided route of roughly 37 to 40 mound sites across the northeast of the state. The Louisiana Division of Archaeology built the trail using federal highway funds, specifically to make these places visible from the public road, because so many of them sit on private land where no one ever sees them. What's strange about Insley is the gap. It's on a state-recognized trail. It has an official marker, and yet its builders and its exact age are still not firmly established in the public record. It is a documented ancient monument that almost no one has studied in depth. It sits on the same Bayou Macon corridor that links many of northeast Louisiana's oldest sites all the way down to Poverty Point, a string of monuments strung along one slow brown waterway. 3 mounds, 1 marker, and a question mark where the explanation should be. Number 10. Hedgepeth Mounds, the last of the first mound builders. No farming, no pottery, no kings. That is who built this place, and it sits at the very end of North America's first great age of monument building. Hedgepeth is a small site in northeast Louisiana. 2 earthen mounds, one about 8 feet tall, the other about 20. Modest if you only look at the dirt. The story is in the date. It belongs to a cluster of sites that Joe Saunders radiocarbon dated to the Middle Archaic, and Hedgepeth is the latest of them, raised somewhere around 5,200 to 4,500 years ago. To understand why that matters, you have to know what archaeologists believed before. The assumption was simple. Monument building required agriculture. You needed farms to produce surplus food, and you needed a ruling elite to command the labor. Mounds meant kings. Then Saunders dated Hedgepeth, Frenchman's Bend, and Watson Brake, and found mobile hunter-gatherers had been raising earthworks 2,000 years earlier than anyone thought possible. Hedgepeth is the closing chapter of that tradition. The mounds still survive in the Louisiana lowlands, hard to see under summer growth, quiet under the cicadas. A 20-foot monument built by people who owned almost nothing and answered to no one. That combination wasn't supposed to exist. Number 9. Caney Bayou Mound. The mound you'd never notice. If you drove past it, you would see a slight rise in a soybean field. A bump, maybe 5.5 feet high, about 130 by 165 feet at the base, sitting right at the edge of a narrow 2-lane road in Morehouse Parish farmland. Without the roadside marker, you would never give it a second look. That bump may be one of the oldest surviving man-made structures in the entire state. Based on soil weathering and the stone tools found around it, archaic period tools with no pottery anywhere, the Louisiana Division of Archaeology dates it to around 3000 BCE. That makes it roughly as old as, or older than, the first pyramids built in Egypt. A monument in a Louisiana bean field, contemporary with the pharaohs. It was one of several of these ordinary-looking rises that quietly rewrote the record in the 1990s. When Saunders and his colleagues started dating mounds in northeast Louisiana, the absence of pottery and the presence of only archaic stone tools pointed at something nobody expected. Builders far older than the farming cultures everyone had assumed were responsible. Hunter-gatherers, shaping the land thousands of years before agriculture reached the region. Caney sits across Bayou Bartholomew from another mound, the Venable Mound, where people kept living and building all the way into the period of the first European contact. So this one stretch of slow bayou holds both ends of the story, the very old and the comparatively recent. The mound is still there. Lower now, worn down by centuries of plowing and rain. You can see it from the road if you know to look. Most people don't. They pass 5,000 years of history at 50 miles an hour and never lift their foot off the gas. Number 8. Mounds, the city that was used and reused for over 1,000 years. Most ancient sites are the work of one people, in one period. Mott's different. On the west bank of Bayou Macon, in Franklin Parish, one mound complex was built, abandoned, and rebuilt by 4 different cultures, one after another, across more than 1,000 years. The Marksville people were there, then the Troyville culture, then Coles Creek, then the Plaquemine culture. Each one came to the same ground, and each one left its own architectural layer on top of the last. Archaeologists call a site like this a palimpsest, a page written over again and again where the older text never quite disappears. Mott was investigated across more than a century, with digs in 1900, in 1913, and again in 2005. The people who studied it include Clarence Bloomfield Moore, one of the famous early figures of American archaeology, and modern scholars like Tristram Kidder and Timothy Schilling. What it tells you is that these places were not chosen at random. Generation after generation, culture after culture, people kept returning to the exact same spot on the bayou and treating it as ground worth building on. The original builders were long gone. The meaning of the place outlived them. That's part of why the Bayou Macon corridor is so thick with earthworks. It wasn't one community making monuments. It was a relay handed down across centuries. Mott is protected now as an archaeological preserve. 4 cultures, 1 piece of ground, and not one of them wrote down why it mattered. Number 7. Monte Sano Mounds, the oldest monument in America, bulldozed for a highway. In 1967, in the Scotlandville area of Baton Rouge, the state needed to build a highway. In the way stood 2 earthen mounds along Monte Sano Bayou near the airport. So the mounds were leveled. Archaeologists were given 3 days. 3 days to dig into something that had stood for thousands of years. What they pulled out in that time was remarkable. Platforms built into the mound, charcoal, effigy beads, projectile points, evidence that at least part of the site had been used for burials and cremation. Then the bulldozers finished, and the highway went in. And in hindsight, the loss is far worse than anyone realized at the time. One of the mounds was later radiocarbon dated to around 6,200 years before present. and the Louisiana Division of Archaeology now describes Monte Sano as the oldest of the state's Middle Archaic mound sites, with construction earlier than 5000 BCE. Some archaeologists argue it may have been the single oldest indigenous mound in the United States. When it was destroyed, researchers still doubted that hunter-gatherer societies were even capable of building something like it. They were wrong. And the proof was sitting right there, in the path of a road project. Today there is nothing to visit. No mound. A highway corridor and developed land sit on top of where it stood. The destruction was so total that online the photo people use to illustrate Monte Sano is usually a picture of a completely different set of mounds, the ones across town at LSU, because there is simply nothing left of Monte Sano to photograph. We dug for 3 days, then paved the oldest thing we had. If you're finding this interesting, take a second to hit the like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people. And tell me in the comments, have you ever driven past a mound, a marker, or a strange old sign somewhere in the South and never stopped to find out what it was? Those stories are how we find places to cover next. We've looked at the small ones and the lost ones so far. From here, the stakes get bigger, and the questions get harder to answer. Number 6. Lower Jackson Mound. The mound that was already ancient when Poverty Point was built. Picture a single conical mound standing alone in the farmland of Macon Ridge, about 10 feet high, 115 feet across at the base, on its own, unremarkable. The strange part is what's around it and when. Radiocarbon dating puts the construction of Lower Jackson somewhere around 3900 to 3600 BCE. For a long time, archaeologists assumed it was just part of the famous Poverty Point complex 2 miles to the north, because Poverty Point-style artifacts turned up nearby, and it sat due south of the Great Mound there. Then Joe Saunders dated the base of it. It turned out Lower Jackson was built roughly 1500 to 2000 years before the rest of Poverty Point. It was already old, ancient even, by the time the Poverty Point people started raising their earthworks around 1700 BCE. And here is the part that genuinely stops people. Lower Jackson lies on a precise north-south line with Poverty Point's later mounds, mounds E, A, and B, on a single straight axis. Archaeologists believe the Poverty Point builders deliberately aligned their entire monumental city onto this far older mound. They built a new sacred landscape pointed straight at one their predecessors had left behind 2,000 years earlier. That is cultural memory, written into the ground across a span longer than the entire history of Christianity. Today the mound survives on private land. It has reportedly been deliberately damaged by a modern owner, one of the oldest mounds in the hemisphere, sitting unguarded in someone's field. 2,000 years apart, and they still lined it up on purpose. Number 5. Marksville, the Ohio culture that turned up 600 miles out of place. 2,000 years ago, on a bluff over an old channel of the Mississippi in central Louisiana, people built a ceremonial complex that doesn't seem to belong where it is. The art, the burial customs, the style of the earthworks. They match a culture centered 600 miles to the north in Ohio and Illinois. The Hopewell. The Marksville site covers 42 acres. Its centerpiece is a semicircular earthwork about 3,300 feet long, 3 to 7 feet high, wrapping around 6 mounds. In 1933, an LSU undergraduate named James Ford, working with the Smithsonian's Frank Setzler, found the evidence that tied Marksville to the Hopewell tradition, and proved that tradition had spread far beyond the Midwest where it was first identified. What no one can fully explain is how. Around 2,000 years ago, people whose ancestors had lived in Louisiana for millennia adopted an entire new cultural package: northern-style burial mounds, particular pottery designs, long-distance trade in exotic materials. The state archaeologist describes Marksville as the first time a single cultural expression stretched across such an enormous area of North America. It showed the continent's peoples were connected in ways no one had assumed. Then, about 400 years after it was built, the site was abandoned. Why, no one knows. And there's a detail here found nowhere else. Marksville has tiny circular earthworks, rings, that appear at no other Hopewell site anywhere on the continent. A unique feature, possibly tied to some activity that happened only here that we have no name for. The earthworks and a museum still stand, but the state historic site has been closed to the public for years now, short on visitors and funding. The Tunica Biloxi tribe has regained ancestral land here, and there are plans for its future. For now, it sits behind a plain metal gate, past a casino and a neighborhood, a monument unlike any other in the Hopewell world, with no one allowed in to see it. Number 4. Troyville Earthworks. The 82-foot wonder a town carted away to build a bridge. At the point in Catahoula Parish where 4 rivers meet, the Ouachita, the Tensas, the Little, and the Black, there once stood the tallest ancient mound in Louisiana. 82 feet high. One of the tallest earthen mounds in all of eastern North America, it is almost entirely gone now. And the way it disappeared is its own kind of story. The Great Mound of Troyville was the centerpiece of a complex of 9 mounds inside a perimeter embankment, built by the Troyville culture during what archaeologists call the Baytown period, roughly 400 to 700 CE. It was not a simple pile of dirt. When the Smithsonian's Winslow Walker finally excavated it, he found it had been engineered, built with internal layers of woven cane matting, palmetto fronds, and wooden planks. Real construction, 1,500 years ago. But Troyville was never protected, and it came apart in pieces, over decades. During the Civil War, soldiers cut into the Great Mound for rifle pits. Then the town of Jonesville was founded right on top of the site in 1871, and the townspeople mined the mound's dirt to fill ditches and level their lots. And then, in 1931, came the final blow. Highway crews leveled what was left of the Great Mound and used the earth as fill for the approach ramp to a new bridge. By the time Walker arrived to document it that same year, most of it was already gone. He was running a salvage operation on a monument being shoveled away around him. Today, of an 82-foot tower, only about 3 feet remain. The other surviving mounds of the complex sit under a Catholic church and a Methodist church cemetery, a town literally built on and out of the sacred ground beneath it. In 2011, Jonesville tried to build a partial reconstruction. A small exhibit of Walker's findings sits in a museum at the University of Louisiana at Monroe. That is the whole arc of it. A monument important enough to be one of the tallest on the continent, taken apart by hand, by cannon, by shovel, and finally by a road crew until it became the on-ramp to a bridge. We turned a 1,500-year-old tower into roadbed, and most of the people driving over it have no idea it's there. Number 3. The LSU Campus Mounds. The oldest structures in the Americas, if the dates are right. Every autumn, tens of thousands of people walk past 2 grassy mounds in the middle of the Louisiana State University campus on their way to a football game. They sit on them. They picnic on them. Most have no idea that they may be sitting on the oldest surviving human-made structures anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, or that scientists are openly, unresolvedly fighting about it. The 2 mounds are about 20 feet tall, side by side on high ground above the Mississippi floodplain. For decades, they were dated to around 6,000 years old. That alone would make them ancient, older than the pyramids. Then, in 2022, things got complicated. An LSU geologist named Brooks Elwood, after roughly 20 years of work, published a paper in the American Journal of Science arguing that construction of one of the mounds began around 11,000 years ago. If that is correct, it would make it the oldest known man-made structure in the Americas, by thousands of years. His team pointed to layers of ash from burned reeds and cane inside the mounds, and even charred fragments of mammal bone to build the timeline. The reaction from other archaeologists was sharp. Specialists at LSU and the University of Louisiana at Lafayette pushed back hard, arguing the oldest dates came from redeposited soil and didn't match anything known about how people lived in this region 11,000 years ago. Their position was blunt. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The same researchers noticed something else, though. The 2 mounds appear to be aligned toward Arcturus, one of the brightest stars in the sky, which 6,000 years ago would have risen right along their crests. So in 2024, a new team went back with a dating method never used on the mounds before, trying to finally settle the age. That question is still open. 6,000 years, or 11,000. No one has closed it. And in the meantime, students cut across the grass between classes, and on game days the crowds pour over the top, walking across maybe the oldest thing human hands ever built on this side of the planet, arguing about the football, not the ground. Number 2. Watson Break, the 5,400-year-old monument that rewrote the rules. 11 Mounds, connected by ridges into a giant oval nearly 900 feet across, the tallest rising about 25 feet off the floor of a forest southwest of Monroe. Construction started around 5,400 years ago and finished around 4,800 years ago. Let those numbers sit for a second. Watson Break is older than the Egyptian pyramids. It is older than Stonehenge. It is around 2,000 years older than Poverty Point, just down the river. And it was built by the wrong people, at least according to everything archaeologists believed for most of the 20th century. The accepted model was firm. Monumental construction required a settled farming society. You needed agriculture to feed a workforce, and you needed a chief or an elite to organize the labor and command it. Mounds were a symptom of hierarchy and surplus. Watson Break had none of that. It was raised in careful stages over roughly 6 centuries by mobile hunter-gatherers. No maize farming, no permanent town, no kings. Small, relatively egalitarian bands who came together generation after generation and built. When the dating was published in 1997, it forced archaeologists to move the date of the oldest earthwork construction back by nearly 2,000 years, and to accept that the people they'd assumed were incapable of this had done it first. The site was only even recognized in the 1980s, when land was being cleared for timber, and a local researcher named Rika Jones looked at the shapes in the ground and understood what they were. The one question the dating can't answer is the biggest one. Why? These people didn't live there year-round. They built 11 mounds and a connecting oval over 600 years for reasons that left no written trace and no obvious practical purpose. Watson Break sits today on private land, deep in the woods, with no road in and no public access. One of the most important archaeological sites in North America, and almost no one will ever stand on it. A society with no kings and no farms built something that has lasted 5,000 years. We still cannot tell you what it was for. Number 1. Poverty Point. The giant earthen bird no one was supposed to be able to build. Stand on the ridge at the right spot, and at first it just looks like open country. High, dry ground above a slow bayou. Wind moving across a wide, grassy plain. There's a low rise in front of you, and another behind it, and another. Long, curved banks of earth, set one inside the next, like ripples frozen in the ground. From where you're standing on foot, you can't quite make sense of the shape. It's too big to read. The wind is the loudest thing out here. Go up. From the air, the whole thing snaps into focus. 6 enormous C-shaped ridges, nested one inside another, curving around a central plaza. And at the edge of them, a single colossal mound, about 70 feet tall and 700 feet long, built in the shape of a bird with its wings spread. From above, you are looking at a planned landscape, geometry, scale, intention, carved into the earth of northeast Louisiana. This was built around 3,700 years ago, and the people who built it had no metal tools, no wheels, and no pack animals. Every basket of soil in those ridges and that bird-shaped mound was carried there by hand, on someone's back. For nearly 2,000 years afterward, it remained the largest earthwork in all of North America. It was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2014, the same global category as the pyramids of Giza and Stonehenge. But there's a problem the experts still haven't solved. For a long time, the assumption was that a place this size must have been a city, with a permanent population and a ruling class to command all that labor. But no one has ever found burials here. No evidence of long-term houses. The newest research from Tristram Kidder and his colleagues suggests Poverty Point wasn't a city ruled by chiefs at all. It points instead to far-flung, egalitarian communities who traveled in, gathered periodically, traded, worshipped, and left offerings, people trying to steady themselves against a world of violent floods and an unstable climate by building something permanent together. It was a hub of trade with stone hauled in from hundreds of miles away. And one last thing ties this entire list together. Remember Lower Jackson Mound from number 6. The conical mound that was already 2,000 years old when the Poverty Point people arrived. They didn't ignore it. They aligned their whole monumental complex onto it on a single straight line. They built their new world pointed directly at the old one. So the largest ancient earthwork on the continent was raised by hand, without and we still don't fully know why they did any of it. You can walk it today. The wind, the ridges, the bird in the ground, all of it's still there, waiting for someone to finally explain it. Louisiana isn't hiding these places. They're in the open, in fields, in suburbs, on a campus, under a church. We just stopped looking. For me, the one that stays with me is Watson Brake. 5,400 years old, built by people with no kings, and we still can't say why. Which of these surprised you most, and which one did we miss? If forgotten history buried in plain sight is your thing, subscribe. We find another one every week.